So everybody has joined. So it's I show that it's 6:36, and this is the September 30th meeting of the Fiber Broadband Completion Task Force. And I'll do a quick roll call. I am Mark Howell, chairperson of the committee. And can I have a roll call from Gail Heyer?
Gail Heyer.
Okay, and Gordon Brockway?
I'm here.
David Hessel?
Here.
And Scott Hopkinson.
Scott Hopkinson here.
Great. So that's the committee. I also see that there are a couple of members of the public and our observer from the finance committee, as well as the select board. The first order of business after the roll call is to announce that this meeting is in fact being recorded on Zoom. It's being held virtually under the authorizations that we continue to have from the state of Massachusetts during the COVID-19 crisis. If you do not want to be recorded or do not, then you may leave now or simply choose not to speak, and you will not be recorded. We need to appoint a clerk for this meeting. Do I have a volunteer, Scott?
I was really hoping to avoid that for another week. I've been really busy with my new job. I can do so if you'd like, if no one else. If it's my turn, I'll do it.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
So I am now the acting clerk.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I think.
Well, it's a certain level of service and contribution that it's great if we can share that. As far as minutes go, I did receive a first draft of the minutes from David Hessel, who was our clerk last meeting. There are a couple of things that need a little enhancement in terms of the mechanics of that. So he has agreed to update those, and you can expect a distribution of them shortly. And we'll proceed with the September 23rd minutes at our next meeting, which is currently scheduled for October 4th. No, what day is next Thursday? I had sent all of you a meeting invitation, and it would be Thursday, October 7th at 6:30 p.m. also on Zoom, and expect the agenda to be posted certainly by Tuesday. So given that we don't have any minutes to approve right now, unless anyone has any particular urgent announcements or comments they want to make, I would recommend that we move right to item 3 on the agenda, which is continue our discussion of the work plan, draft definitions and data requests. All right. Specifically, what I had done this week was an attempt to try to bring our definitions of what we're working on in terms of data requests into focus for the committee. And as is indicated in the agenda, there are 3 focus areas that are specifically outlined in the committee charge, and then a 4th more general area listed as task force may choose to explore additional issues. And it seemed that it would be helpful to actually work on specific definitions of what is meant by this. This is a Google Doc. The doc should be available to anyone to view, and I had distributed the link to this document via email to the committee yesterday, and we will include this link in our meeting minutes. So the idea was to take these 3 areas, A being the last 5 to 7% of streets.
One quick kind of semi-procedural comment, Mark. This document was shared view only for the other folks, so we weren't really given an opportunity to edit it.
Mhm.
I just wanted a quick comment or ask about whether that was your intention, or so how, if we have inputs to this document, should we provide them via email to you, or do you want to make it so that the committee members can add comments in the document?
I was concerned, and I'd be happy to be guided by this, that enabling collaboration of that sort through
Oh, yeah, yeah.
means outside of the meeting would be an
Yep.
open meeting law violation. So the intention is to provide access to the document so that anyone has visibility to do it, but to actually collaborate about the document within the meeting framework. So
Oh, no, perfect. Yeah, I'll make a note in our minutes that that's how we're going to use it. Thank you very much.
great. Thanks for the question. No, it is important. I think that these tools are both extremely useful, but there is a real concern for this. So the idea was to have this be something that we would use, I think, as a way of introducing the specific target areas. What we talked about at the last time was identifying what data what do we mean by each of these sections? What data do we need to understand them better? And then begin to look at what solutions might be proposed, or what policy recommendations we might be making to the light board or others for addressing the objectives defined in this. So what I tried to do in terms of writing up this, and I believe the idea was to capture some of the previous discussion that we've had in the last two meetings, was to both define and differentiate between these areas, because as we've talked about, there's a great deal of potential for overlap within each of these areas. And by sort of delineating how they in fact do differ from each other, we create an opportunity, I think, to move with a little bit more efficiently and know what we're talking about. So the proposed definition for the last 5 to 7%. First off, let me ask: is this coming through clearly on the screen for each of you? Can you read it? Okay, I could probably zoom it a little bit more. Maybe that.
Yeah, zooming in is helpful.
Okay.
I would agree with that.
Okay, great.
Just one real quick thing. I'm planning to copy or capture the fact that we're having this discussion without all the details. So unless you want more details, that go.
Yeah, I think that from the minutes perspective, we'd want to refer to the document. We'll capture a version of the document as it was presented today. Certainly we can make some edits and change the date. And I'm very open. In fact, I'm encouraging those of you that have comments to simply add to these lists, and thinking that these are things that will serve to allow us to both introduce the topics and define how we might approach them once we've sort of settled on the definitions. So I think the first section, A, is to some extent the most straightforward. This concept of the last 5 to 7% of the streets is really capturing the concept that we talked about a little bit at the last meeting, which is there are some parcels which simply don't have fiber in the right of way outside of them. So that would be a fairly standard industry definition of a parcel which is served, which is a term that the FCC uses. And that typically means that a provider has the ability to connect that based on infrastructure that is already built. The objective of this area is to define which branches are not served and determine why they're not served, and recommend policies that established, and there's a typo right there. If when that establishes if when and how fiber could be extended to serve them. Defined, okay. So it's an established fact that CMLP did not install fiber in all of the right-of-ways on all of the streets in Concord. This area study will define and examine and establish which roads remain without fiber and are therefore not served. Each area that does not have fiber now will be assigned a reason code. So we could look at, is it underground? Is it some kind of new construction? What is the acknowledged reason for the lack of fiber in those areas? And it would be up to us, I think, to understand what reasons are established already and whether or not there are any other useful ones. And then given those areas which are not served, the next step, which kind of goes to B, but would be to understand which residential and business premises are not served due to a lack of fiber in the right of way. An example might be, a big area of conservation land may not be served, but if nobody lives there and nobody's doing business there, it's probably not important that that area be served. And so we might legitimately decide that there are some areas that do not require service for reasons like they're not a residence or a business premise. The task force would then be expecting to look at programmatic solutions for addressing the reasons. So some construction programs, capital allocations, those kinds of things. And the metrics in this area, I think, are fairly clear. Once we have firmly established which parcels and streets are not served, then it would be possible to understand at what rate that service area is being expanded. I think it goes without saying that for the moment, or may not go without saying, but it's important to note that we're talking about the current CMLP service area. And this is not, I don't think, any attempt to say, what happens if that service area were to change or there was going to be some expansion someplace else. I think that is out of scope. So that's kind of,
just to be clear, what you're saying is out of scope is something like extending it to Carlisle or things of that nature. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that
I just want to make sure and got it. Thanks.
Yeah, and certainly this would be a great time for anybody to chime in on, does this sort of meet your expectations, and is there anything that you feel is overlooked or should be clarified about this particular topic of the last 5 to 7% of streets?
I guess I was thinking when you were talking about, the FCC definition or the term of service, and maybe it's obvious because, the committee's charge is to complete the fiber network, but what we're just looking at, Concord Light broadband fiber, and not like, some of these folks obviously have, they probably don't have fiber, but they have internet or broadband, from some other source, but we're just looking at, Concord Light fiber because that's our, I don't know, maybe that goes without saying, but I just wanted to.
I think that's
See if that's clear.
Yes, I think that is a good point. We're not trying to, we understand that there may be other service providers. We are specifically focused on whether Concord Light broadband's fiber serves any particular parcel.
Okay, thanks.
Or street. Any other comments? Okay. if seeing none, if we think this definition works, then I'm going to suggest that we move through all 4 definitions of the areas, and then that may prompt some discussion about how to differentiate or whether something might have landed in a different area. Does anyone have any objection to that approach? Okay.
No.
Great. So barriers to subscription growth. This idea, in my interpretation, is the focus on premises that are currently served by the fiber optic network, and establish if there are any policy or programmatic inhibitors to adoption. In other words, this also builds on our discussion from last week. People that are making a decision about whether or not they would like to actually receive service from the broadband fiber system. And so it's going to be a look at the demand and decision making among potential subscribers, and try to establish whether there are any things that might be in place or should be adjusted that would maybe encourage broader adoption. And it could delve into trying to understand whether people have knowledge of our offerings. We know there's been relatively low levels of marketing for this, whether the cost of value of the offerings are considered to be appropriate, what inhibitors are there to installation, and that would be over and above, is there fiber in the right of way? So if the fiber passes the premise, is there anything beyond that which is stopping these particular subscribers from taking that? And again, we would be looking for groups and classes, it's not an individual marketing effort, I don't think, but more of a treatment of what are the strategies in place to do that. Last week, we talked a little bit about the impact of the underground bylaw. I'm conducting a search to try and make sure that we get a copy of that. I think it's important for us to actually look at it and make sure that we understand what it says. I know how it's been interpreted over time and how it's being implemented, but it is worthwhile to look at it. There may be others. Those were just 3 or 4 that 4 that came to mind. Some of the
Well, wait. Oh, is it okay for me to jump in here?
Sure, absolutely, Gordon.
So, I mean, the impact of the underground bylaw could be that it requires us to install any new fiber underground.
Mhm.
Maybe if there's telephone poles and the other services have not been undergrounded yet, then we can, I'm pretty sure that we get to use the telephone pole too, because I can't imagine that there's any other way they would have rolled it out. You probably know this better than me, Mark. But the impact is that there could be a differential cost
Mhm.
for us rolling out the fiber underground rather than hanging it on the poles. So it's just more expensive.
That is correct. And in with respect to that, on the electric service, there are some programs in place, for example, that are specifically aimed at assisting residents in certain circumstances with the cost of, for example, putting in conduit in order to be in compliance with the underground bylaw. We don't have anything like that in place for the fiber side. So that's why I'm suggesting that at least taking a look at how that's practically implemented. This is an example, but this is the kind of inhibitor which may exist that causes some people, for example, who might otherwise want to have fiber, to say that's too much trouble, or that's too expensive, or just choose to stay with their provider or not. So we might want to understand, in terms of recommendations or approaches, we might want to understand whether there's any other programs or solutions, programmatic solutions that might be able to be put in place to try to reduce that if we find that that is in fact a significant inhibitor. And,
So
you know,
you're grouping together, to me, what feel like two different issues, mainly because in the current scheme of things, there are two different payers, right? That the town pays for getting the service to your your address at the street, but then residents have to pay to bring it from the street into their home, and there may be a differential cost doing that, depending on whether or not they have to dig and place conduit, or if they can just bring something in overhead. I don't know. Are those different prices? Maybe.
yeah. Well, it certainly is. If there's available conduit, or if the customer is in an overhead area, then the flat rate of the installation fee covers the cost of install for that customer, and they pay the $150 installation fee, and the fiber is brought right to the desk inside the home in effect. If it turns out, though, that the customer is in an underground area and there is no available conduit, this is the Concord Green issue, but it comes up in other places as well, then the answer from Concord Light Broadband up until now has been the customer needs to make available conduit at their own expense, and then that conduit will be used. So there is clearly a difference, and that is an inhibitor. And spoiler alert, I'm familiar with the data for the first 5 or 6 years, and there were a not insignificant number of customers who placed orders, got to the stage where they discovered that was their situation, and then at that point decided that they were not going to go forward with that effort, and therefore were never installed. So
Just curious, do you happen to know, Mark, if like I'm a Comcast internet customer, and Comcast had to upgrade the service, the quality of the lines in order to bring in the new platform and all the great stuff. Could Concord use Comcast's conduit, or is that sort of like private property?
I can't answer that authoritatively because I don't know what Comcast's position is on whether or not they actually own that conduit, or whether they're actually giving it to you if they install it on your property. That's, the question comes down to who owns the conduit. Obviously, if I put conduit in my own property and I can run whatever I want through it because it's clearly mine. But if I let a service provider install conduit of their own, does that, what terms and conditions what are the terms and conditions are under which they do that, and charge me or don't charge me for it is something that we wouldn't necessarily have knowledge of.
Because if we could make it work, that would be an opportunity. We're basically picking off Comcast service. Good.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
And again, Comcast is not the only one that falls subject to this. Obviously, the telephone company also has the same situation. So that the incumbent cable supplier as well as telephone can be doing. And there have got to be other ones. I do think.
What about power?
What about power?
Is that, could that be in a conduit that we could piggyback on?
Generally
or
speaking,
is that taboo?
You can't run them in the same conduit. We've been told you can't run them in the same conduit.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a safety concern primarily.
Sure.
Is that true, Mark? Just a quick technical question. Is that true if you're running fiber? It has no conductivity capabilities.
Yeah.
I can, go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead, David, you can.
Well, we're mapping out our conduit for, excuse me, for two purposes: EV and CM and broadband. And we've met with 2 electricians, and both electricians have told us that we cannot use the conduit on a shared purpose, one for broadband, and then run also EV charging cable through that they have to be separate.
Mhm.
That you can't share the conduit.
Yeah, I believe that that is true. And I don't know specifically whether that's code or best practices or safety or policy. And it's probably worth it to try to establish which one that is. It's clearly not a recommended solution. To some extent, it has a lot to do with what the actual size of the conduit is and what kind of it's a space issue. But anyway, I think returning briefly, that was a little bit of a digression, but that clearly is one of the things that's actually relatively unique to Concord. I know that it impacted a number of customers when we were first doing the installation. We run into it constantly, and I believe we coded for that to some extent when, if an order got canceled because of the lack of conduit, that was data that we were collecting. And so I believe there should be data available from CMLP about how many of those there are. And it would be interesting to, I think, understand from an order of magnitude perspective what it was. I have a recollection that it might have been as many as 30 to 40% of canceled orders were canceled for that reason, which is a significant inhibitor going forward, because we didn't have other solutions, and there are some solutions that are available. But I think that it's also important to look at other. It's really easy, I think, for us to focus on one particular thing, and it may turn out that that's the most important, but other issues. And I think Pamela Dritt raised one in her citizen comments last year, like, for example, the lack of a television service offering was certainly in the early days of this, when streaming wasn't as well understood or as ubiquitous as it is now. We found that quite a few customers said, well, if I still have to keep my television service as is, and you don't have a live TV alternative, then maybe I because it's only internet. So that could fit into the cost of the value of the services, and there are others. And what I would suggest we do is at some point we probably want to actually brainstorm on what they are, as well as try and understand how we might gain more information directly from customers or potential customers about what inhibitors they perceive.
Mark, I certainly agree with what you just said. And I think that because of this, in the end, the data requests that we're going to generate will be actually twofold. One for the GIS information, which was the thing that drove our original, the petition and the activity, but there's likely another data request that's more aligned or more to the light plant's current database of information that you've alluded to, that we know, there's lots of information that I think would be very important or very useful to know. The one that you just described, the other one is, what is the history of people that have actually signed up for the service and discontinue it? Has there anybody, what percentage of people have done that? These are things I think we'll want to know to help frame the problem statement.
Yes. Yeah, and that's what this exercise is about, is to try to be sure that we're clear on the problem statement, and then try to move that into a discussion about how to find solutions. So yeah.
Can I add? So I had the same thought that Scott did. We should find out if people cancel and don't continue their subscription, it would be good to know the reasons for that. And the other piece was, we may have discussed this at one point. I think the town does a survey, an annual survey, and I feel like there is a question on there about the broadband. Is it? So
They do.
yeah,
Yeah, they
so
do.
that would be a data request for us, to, you know, to get that information. There could be some reasons in that.
I think it's in the public record.
Yes, I think you're right, Gordon. I believe it's even published on the CMLP website.
Oh, okay.
Some of the data that's
Which,
done.
and by the way, I mean, out of deference to staff time, I'd like to keep this list of demands as you know, light as possible. I mean, I work in litigation, and you know, you can very easily swamp you know, an opponent with discovery requests and stuff like that. So you know, any instances where we could develop the data ourselves and not have to, and it's probably a good idea too, if we can find some way to get the data ourselves, or with a minimal lift
Yeah,
from staff. That's going to help avoid roadblocks and so forth.
so part of our data request, Gordon, I think it's a good idea, might be to, and Mark has the insight because he was on that side as well, which is to, for us, when we get to the framework of what we're going to ask for, let's say from Concord Broadband for data, which is to sit with them and see what is the most convenient way for them to hand us that data. You know, there's likely to be some pretty convenient ways for them to do an export of the information we need into some sort of comma delimited file or Excel spreadsheet, and then we can take it up and deal with the processing of it after the fact. So I've been thinking about that. And I think when we get a little further into the details of those data requests, we'll want to make sure that we do that in a way that's both gives us the data we need and minimizes the impact on the town staff.
Yeah, good.
I think we're all agreed on that. And part of the purpose of this exercise is to, as much as possible, be clear about what the purposes are and what we're looking for, so that we can, you know, provide a clearly understandable and hopefully easy to respond to set of information. The orders, which is what are generated when somebody hits the button to order service on the light on the website, do generate a record that's in a single file, which is actually relatively easy to address. I think that, you know, we may need to look at some privacy issues and talk about how we're going to handle that, or even have someone responsible for, you know, anonymizing that information or doing things like that, because I do think that there may be some issues in there that we'll also want to discuss, but I think we can probably, those are manageable, and it is fairly straightforward. So
do we want to talk just for a moment about that privacy issue? Because again, we can skip to a later time about that.
Yeah, I think we can think about it a little bit later. I mean, generally speaking, we're talking about, you know, names, addresses, and you know, names and addresses is for the most part, but there is some other information like phone numbers and email addresses and things.
So
like
I was thinking that from our, just not to spend too much time on this, but it may be that we want to have address and then any history about orders or cancel orders or whatnot. And, you know, part of that may be to better understand this whole business of barriers to subscription. I think I have to go back and look, but the last time I checked, the tax records include people's names and addresses and valuation of their property. So we're, you know, I think if we're careful, we can make that request in a way that is less information than is actually available already with the tax records. So.
Yeah, and of course, you know, we would not. I can't see any need to expose individual records in a meeting format like this. I think what we probably want to do is take the data and have a member of this task force or something try to summarize that data in it, or one or two people
That-
working together
That's a great idea. Run
Come up
the
with a
analytics
summary.
on the raw data and then present the
and
summary.
then present it. Yeah,
Yeah, sounds good.
would be my
Yeah,
thing.
and that may work. I don't know. There's a risk that just about any of the work product that this committee generates, or even source information, could be public.
Mhm.
So it's, and that's, whether or not that's true, I'm not sure. I think it's more likely to be true that if a town employee is handling that data, then it's not necessary, it is less discoverable or less public. So if we can, anyway, so just, we might want to think of ourselves as acting in a public way,
Yes.
even if only one of us has that data. So
Mhm.
anyway.
Fair point. So some of the metrics that I could identify in this, take rate is and that's an industry term. It basically refers to out of the number of potential subscribers based on parcels or residences or premises that you pass, what percentage are actually subscribing versus the entire number. Subscriber levels I think is actually another way of thinking about that. I'm not quite sure why I chose those. New installations performed, meaning sort of we would track how many installations we've done per month. Again, I think some of these metrics are also useful for us to recommend in terms of if there's a program over time which is designed to try to increase subscriber growth and increase the availability of service, we should consider which metrics represent good ways for the staff and the light board to track progress over time, and that could certainly be installations could be one of those. Reasons for cancellations or incomplete orders and percentage of successfully completed orders, so that that percentage of success obviously also goes to the cost of the service itself. If we have a higher percentage of completed orders, that's less overhead cost or waste
Mark,
in the process. Yes.
I think that the backlog is expressed in time. So
Yeah.
how many, in other words, how long does a potential subscriber have to wait? And honestly, I've been focusing on that myself as the key performance metric.
I might have skipped over that. I had written in here cycle times associated with installation. So
Oh, okay, that's what you meant.
how
by that.
long between
Okay.
the customer making a request for an order, how soon do they get seen, how soon from the time that they actually place us. So there's two things. There's this broadband order form that the customers fill out that indicates their level of interest. And then when once the team has met with them and they're giving an opportunity to actually place an order, which is usually a commitment to pay the $150 and saying, yes, in fact, I do want you to come and install service. So from that date to when service is actually installed or that order is canceled are very important to understand, I think, in terms of backlog. So you're absolutely right.
So if, Mark, you and I had this conversation. So if I moved into Concord today
Mhm.
and I run it and I said, yes, I do want broadband and CMLP, what is that wait time that you're aware of?
It has varied significantly over time. If
Okay.
you happen to be moving into a premise that had already had the fiber actually installed in it at a previous time, it could be a matter of single digit number of days, a couple,
Okay.
for somebody to come back out, reconnect it. If it's an area that requires some significant construction or frankly the wrong time of year weather-wise, it can be weeks, if not months.
Okay.
And actually, it is months now. I don't remember the numbers, but the broadband people spoke at the light board meetings recently, and I think it could even be 120 days. We got really hit hard by COVID.
Well, I
then
mean,
installation
didn't
slow
they,
down in the winter.
I mean, I think they indicated that they stopped them all together for some, well over a year, right?
I
Okay.
don't think they stopped them. Well, yeah, pretty much. It really
Yeah.
slowed to a crawl.
Yeah, I guess my understanding from a previous meeting, it was full stop for a very long period of time.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
to the point now where, they're looking at hiring help.
So the customer who doesn't have a pre-existing basically doesn't wait, they'll move to Comcast or to somebody else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that there is a correlation between how many orders are canceled and what that lengthy wait time is. There's no
Yeah.
no
And I
doubt
think
about
they
it.
said that they could potentially do 30 a month.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I don't know how long it's been since they've actually done 30 in a month, but
Mhm.
that's kind of like their nameplate capability.
Yeah, that something over, maybe even approaching 40 tended to be the peak month of any given year.
Oh,
With a, sort of around March, April, you'd begin to get some installations being able to be done, and then it would peak in the late summer and fall, and often run pretty much at that level right through until the weather started to turn cold. Over time, as the base of already installed premises increase, then the ability to do these, call them reinstallations of places where the fiber already is, starts to go up, and so you don't hit zero. In the first year or two, we actually, literally hit zero in some months of the wintertime because of low volumes and the fact that everything needed to be a new fiber pole, new splicing outside, and all of those things. So
is part of you just can't cut into frozen ground? Is that the
yeah,
problem?
if the splice case is underground, or you can't get through the frozen earth, or if there was one winter where there were 5-6 foot tall snowbanks just covering everything, and you just can't work in that, and not with fiber. So those are some of the inhibitors. It can't is
That's the thing. I mean, it actually is doable, but this whole
Yeah.
conversation is the context of cost.
right. Emergency restoration, for example, on an existing customer would be undertaken no matter what the conditions, pretty much, because you have to re-enable someone who's already there. But the expenses and the potential for disrupting existing customers for trying to do a new install in those conditions could be too high to make it worth it. So those are all considerations.
How about this? I'm sorry, just is it also the splicing, or is it really just the digging?
Well, splicing needs to be done in a temperature controlled environment. So once you get below freezing, splicing, you have to actually try to bring the splice case, for example, into a truck, which can raise the temperature and so forth. We had cases where the splice case gets filled with water and the water freezes. Now the signal still goes through all of that, but you can't take it apart to actually do more on it. You have to thaw it out carefully, for example.
Okay.
So pretty much
Well,
it is the outdoor environment.
yeah, no, and so I'm sorry for derailing the conversation, but I mean, in terms of barriers to these are really serious limitations, and it's like as if we can only work half the year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in this environment, some of those are barriers, and to the extent that those things affect the ability to provide service on a timely basis, I think that is that's a fair question. And I mean, the weather is the weather, so one has to keep those in mind. That said, there are ways to mitigate that. For example, bringing the fiber all the way to the inside wiring closet a building that has rental units or something like that, now all of a sudden you don't have to work outside anymore, and so the closer that you get to the premise, the more likely you are to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And hanging, fiber can be hung on poles. You just, you have to wait for the right conditions to make those last few days. We did quite a bit of work on the system to try to make sure that the splice cases, even the aerial splice cases, could be brought down and brought into a truck so that that work could be done. And that hopefully gets you to the place where there's a relatively small number of days per year where you really can't do anything, but occasionally those conditions exist. So those are metrics. I actually, the track backlog over time. I added that in response to your comment, Gordon, and I'm going to.
Thank you.
I'm going to change this date just so that we know that what we're talking about. And I'll probably resave this as a different name, Scott, so that you have the ability to.
Actually, I downloaded a snapshot to my
Great.
local drive. So
Thank
if you
you.
just, I've got it.
Okay, good. That's perfect then. Okay, let's see. I think we were down to E. So this is, I ended up with a couple of questions, and Gail, thank you for providing some feedback, because I think these next couple came to some extent out of the direct comments that you already made on this document. It prompted me to think about this notion of, can policies be developed to encourage subscriptions in geographic areas or favoring underserved residents? In other words, are there geographical areas or are there residents that are underserved, or potentially residents that have certain characteristics that we might want to encourage higher levels of broadband adoption in? For example, school children that need access to remote education facilities or something like that. It's kind of a general question, but I thought that this area in particular, thinking about who the customer is and what does it take to get there, and are there any other programs or subsidies like the emergency broadband benefit, which was widely used by cable providers and others during the pandemic, to defray some of the costs of reaching customers who might otherwise not be able to afford or be underserved. So those are some of the ideas. I think there's probably certainly more in there. Yes, Gordon.
Well, I think that apartment dwellers, as David can attest, are underserved in town. So that's a category that you may address here. Okay. The other thing is, it was a real eye opener when we had that outage, that involved the DHCP assignment servers a few months ago, that it potentially could have impacted emergency services, including the fire and police. Mm-hmm. So the fact that we're a carrier for such life safety services really raises the stakes a lot. Mm-hmm. So where I'm going with that is that there may be categories of customers that need to stand above and beyond others because of how important they are to the community. Mm-hmm. And so if you put just a normal resident at one end of the spectrum and, town fire and police at the other, there may actually be some in the middle too that require a little bit more quality of service, a stronger guarantee than we're currently capable of offering. And I'm thinking of things where there are people who would depend on this service for life safety, mm-hmm. but for some medical reasons or something like that. Mm-hmm. So, I think that right now, if I understand what Greg explained we really have two classes of service, commercial and residential. I don't think that they're really distinguished much beyond that, other than, you know, some technical details. But what I'm driving at is that if you've got a class of service that's really important to Concord, then we may want to have redundant fiber. You know, maybe the idea of those two opposite directed rings, you know, like a sonnet ring.
Sonnet, yeah, Gordon.
Yeah.
One thing, you know, on this subject, you know, first of all, we have a similar program for power, right? Because if someone were on a iron lung or something like that, I wonder if this is an area that the broadband wants to take on this responsibility for being life critical. I can tell you as an electronic designer, there are up and down the chain of designing chips and boards and systems. Many vendors will not allow you to use a piece of equipment in a life critical application unless you get specific written permission from them, and they may even give you different pricing, and the equipment may cost different, and so forth and so on. So I'm not sure, you know, I wouldn't want to be in a situation where I was dependent or had anyone dependent on, from a life survival viewpoint, be dependent on Concord Broadband, because the infrastructure is not designed that way. Yes, it would be nice to use dual redundant rings to reach the police. You know, I know Mark designed the network from the external viewpoint so that we touch two different ISP service providers. And there's a pretty funny story about Braintree where they tried to do that. Sure enough, the fiber laid through the same trench and the same tractor cut through both of them simultaneously. So, you know, I just want to, you know, just on that subject, it makes me a little nervous if we start going down that path.
Yeah.
I think I've tried to frame Gordon's comment as, is the service capable of supporting customers with critical availability requirements? And of course, you know, would you want to? I know that in terms of discussing the service with particularly business customers, I often would remind those customers that if they truly have high availability needs, they probably need to be contracting with multiple service providers and inquiring, you know, really trying to ascertain whether those multiple service providers are in fact using diverse facilities to provide service. And that's an important level. But I think it's a good point to consider is, you know, it's another flavor of, does the service really meet the needs as understood by various customers?
And let me just say one thing. I don't know how devastating or not the impact of that loss of IP service was at the town safety buildings.
Yeah.
It could have just been that they could no longer browse the internet. And I'm confident that they have deep communication capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
You know,
there are multiple redundant service providers of different kinds, including other alternatives to communications that are available to public safety. So if anybody's worried about that, however, and I think it is probably worth it for us to, in terms of the work that we do, to stay on the broadband services offered to residential and business customers, and not try to get too involved in the design of the broadband and internal town of Concord network in order to meet the needs of the town's business operations. I would say that, you know, if you look at the two roles that are involved here, the CIO of the town has a responsibility to make sure that that they have contracted with appropriate service providers to meet the needs of the town. The school department, for example, as they became increasingly dependent on broadband, used to take service both from Concord Light and from another internet service provider. because they needed that redundancy. So that would be an example. And the town may elect to do the exact same thing, even though one of those providers is their own. They still maintained, and in fact, when I was in that role, did maintain some capability through another internet service provider. And within the design of the service also had some capabilities which, to the greatest extent possible, weren't always dependent on all of the things that were part of the commercial service. So that makes sense. This is a bit of a digression. So let's get to the last couple sections. As usual, these discussions take a little while. This C was one that I sort of really felt it was important to kind of think about what are we really talking about here when we talk about fiber to the home, fiber to the business, and AKA the last mile. So if we assume that in letter A, we're talking about, does the fiber optic service pass the customer's premise, potential customer's premise, or not? So that's what A is about. And B is about, does that customer know and understand what the service is and want it, or is there some reason why, even though they do want it, they feel inhibited from being able to get it? This one, I think, is a little bit more mechanistic, and it's a subset of customers that include premises that are on parcels which are served in the right-of-way, so they're not in Group A, but they have some additional obstacle that's kind of beyond the control of the potential customer. So this is where I think we would lump in the homeowners association systems, the rental residences, and even potentially the commercial rental residences, where those customers, there's some intermediary in the middle of there who is somehow interfering with, or capable of interfering with, or needs to be cooperating with in order for the service to get through. So that's kind of what I interpret this to be. Before we, get into the details of that, does that jive with the rest of your thinking? Gil, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a little bit of overlap between B and C, but you're right that by C, what I was intending was really the logistics, like how do you get it from the street into the house? Sometimes it's a simple, like, oh, they pay the $150, there's a telephone pole, you hang it, goes into the house, like that's what they did at my house. So it wasn't, the last mile to get to my house was no big deal. So, but other situations, are very different. So this might be the place where we have categories, just like with the, I think we have categories in letters A and B as well. But, what are the struggles from getting it, from the right of way to the street? And I meant like not struggles, like just the person doesn't want it. That's what B gets at. But, physically, how can this be accomplished, and how do you break it down into manageable pieces? What are the costs to handle this type of last mile versus the cost to handle, some other type. So,
yeah.
So I have a suggestion here is, we have defined these categories, or this document does define those categories, which we will be looking at as we get to the sort of refining the problem statement. But it may turn out that one of these categories has a lot of people in there. We need to reorganize the boundaries of those categories, or we may find that, some category that we've described here has very few people. So I think I'm okay with, this is a great first binning of the different kinds of problems we would have. And then let's let the data drive us to the next step, which is, do we need to reorganize those bins? When we sort of triage it, I'm hoping that we'll come up with a, of those percentage of people that aren't getting it, what are the, what's the largest group, or what is the barrier, what's the next group, and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
If I could just add under C, and I don't want to I just want to give you a thumbnail, and I think maybe I'd give some of it. One of the barriers to Concord Green having broadband is CMLP.
Mhm.
It's not a lack of interest on our part, not a lack of spending hours trying to figure out.
Mhm.
It's a lack of information saying, oh, you don't have the broadband there, or maybe you do have the broadband there. But if you want to figure out how to get broadband there, you get an electrician in there and you figure out where to run the conduits, because we're not going to figure it out for you. So it's a little frustrating, and I'll express my opinion. It goes back to CMLP. It doesn't come back to us not trying to figure it out.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, I think that's part of the purpose of this committee. Was part of our recommendation, I suspect, I hope, will be that we'll have typical scenarios such as Concord Green, such as Kai's Road, such as Concord Muse, such as similar things. And we may come with a set of recommendations for these kinds of facilities. You know, here are the kinds of solutions and here are the considerations, for example. I think, and so that will be, you know, if a Concord Green or one of the other facilities or homeowners group then comes to you know, hopefully we would be able to reach out to the most obvious ones, the ones I just listed, and try and inform them that if you're interested in this, here's what needs to be done. And then the other part of it may be, and Mark talked about it quite elegantly previously, which is to what degree will Concord Light be willing to take responsibility beyond what is normally the demarcation point, which is at the edge of the premise, typically a wiring closet. So, you know, and maybe there's a business model that supports that, where Concord Light or their contractors owns infrastructure that gets placed in the building and it has a payback mechanism or something like that. But, you know, I think the first part is to understand what is the nature of those problems and what is the possible solution. And then the second part will be figuring out how to pay for it and who owns it ultimately.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I would only say that the reception we've gotten is less than cooperative.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can agree. I can understand. I'm not defending
Yeah. No,
whatever
I'm not-
reception. I mean, I've been through this with Eugene before he left, and many conversations over the years on this subject matter. And Mark's probably been through 10 times as many. But I think the first part of the problem is to give people a basic understanding of what are the challenges and how to and some potential solutions. And that's what our goal is here. I think that's core to what we're trying to do, frankly.
Yeah, those are good points. And I think that there is not a clearly defined programmatic solution for that's been implemented within CMLP for these. I think that if as I think about this a little bit more and listen to the discussion, that I think what this group kind of all has in common is that there is some third party. So if the first party is CMLP and the second party is the customer who actually wants the service, if there's a third party that has responsibility or ownership of something in between where the fiber leaves the right of way and where it actually gets into the premise where the second party wants to use it, being able to influence that third party to be interested in actually facilitating the installation and therefore the agreement between the first and second parties is really what we see going on in here. You know, a landlord for a rental, whether it be commercial or residential, may not feel like spending the money to have all the fiber run to all of their premises, and they, you know, if their tenants already have a single provider, they may or may not see the value in having a second provider. And so kind of teasing out what those programs are and to what extent it's even possible for CMLP to facilitate overcoming some of those barriers, I think, is where this particular area goes.
Is there a possibility that anybody that would be in this position to kind of that lies in that, the agent, as you described earlier, Mark, you talked about tenants in buildings and commercial tenants in buildings. Are there any situations, and should we consider any situations where the person that's the entity that's in between them would actually be disincentivized to enable Concord broadband? For example, and this is kind of a little bit of a stretch, but example, we get paid a franchise fee from Comcast, which funds our public television activities. I think I heard somewhere along the line that there was some other promotional activities, marketing development funds kind of thing, that are paid in other contexts. Is that something that we need to be aware of and thinking about or looking into as we go through this process? I mean, for example,
Yeah.
do you understand my question?
I do. I guess I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I guess I'm inclined to add it as a question in here just to see. I'm not sure how we get visibility to that.
Maybe Scott, you may have heard that Comcast paid us $27,500. I'm not sure if that's what you heard. You're referring to Concord Green. For
yes,
marketing?
yeah. That's typical market development funds, MDFs. Intel does this with Microsoft and with Dell and so forth. That's why you see Intel Inside on the corner of every Dell machine.
Right.
They pay them a huge number of market development funds, and so that is a barrier, a real intangible barrier that could get in the way for deployment.
It doesn't here. It's just that they have the rights to market in our main office, and no one else can market, but they don't even put any marketing in our main office.
Yeah, I am aware of the fact that I ran into at least one complex that was built in Concord where they had essentially signed an exclusive deal with the cable provider and they essentially informed us that because they'd taken these payments and provided that given that provider exclusivity to the premises, they weren't going to go forward. So I think to some extent that's an awareness thing of an alternative. So where those things exist, I don't see that as being something that we could necessarily do something about, but it is a good question as to what extent do those kinds of agreements exist. And I think to some extent some organizations might be inclined, or landlords, for example, might be inclined to think of that as free money or reduction in cost, not necessarily recognizing that there was an alternative had they elected not to do that. Then there's the business negotiations of how do you get around those things. But anyway,
just one real quick thing on that, Mark. At the very least, when we do our statisticals, if there is such an entity, let's say that's sequestered 100, 200, 300 endpoints as an exclusive relationship, we should mark those and document that as part of the, here's the problem statement. These people are underserved because we cannot legally go there.
Yeah.
Based on some
They may have
pre-existing
made-
contract.
They may have made agreements to do so. So that's probably
Interesting. Thanks. I was unaware of that.
Yeah, we're up against it's 7:45. So let's look at this last area. This is clearly this was meant to be open-ended for our group. So I'm going to put the request out there right now that if there are other areas that you think of that we might want to consider, we could probably spend a whole meeting just trying to understand this. But it was, as I summarized it, additional issues related to the mission, business, and financial policies. And I believe the rest of that was Concord like broadband or fiber network and sustaining operations. I just shortened it here. So the task force will discuss recommendations for how the citizens of Concord express their preferences for CMLP fiber services. Currently, town meeting, the select board, the light board, the town manager as CMLP general manager, and CMLP staff all potentially have roles in guiding the priorities of the fiber broadband service. This implies a complex governance structure that could be more clearly delineated. The task force will discuss recommendations in this area, which could include specific process and procedures to establish, and this was my list, so please add to it or give me feedback on it, but goals and priorities for universal access, which has a specific meaning. Again, it means that everybody has equal access to the service. Choice of services provided by CMLP, like those decisions about telephone or video or other services. Could be capital allocation priorities and the use of capital for fiber, which would be a financial policy. Operating return objectives for telecommunication services. Again, this is something that's never really been discussed or defined, and so I think putting it on the table that some objectives might be established for that. Pilot, which is payment in lieu of taxes, which CMLP already does do, and payment in lieu of franchise, which is something that was new this year, and what the policies are associated with doing that are probably would fall into this area. Strategic planning goals for the Concord broadband business. So discussions about, territory size, implementation goals, those kinds of things. The next area that came to mind for me was what synergies are there between the fiber network and the sustainability principles, and how does the fiber support community resilience? I think it does already. I think it's underappreciated, and I think that it got left out of the Envision Concord kind of planning, and I think it's important to make those connections in terms of the town long-range plan.
Mark, just a typo there, and letter suits principles with PLE.
Thank you.
Not PAL. And you could even capitalize it, because Concord has the 4 sustainability principles. So,
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. And identify financial programs that may support the expansion of the fiber system and the adoption of the service. So this has come up in several discussions and didn't seem to fit in any of the others above, so I thought put it here. What are the methods for funding capital projects such as undergrounding? Right now, there's no specific set aside from the fiber from the broadband operations to try to enhance or accelerate undergrounding. Underground funding is something that is always in short supply. Methods for funding service drops and conduit construction. So this gets into what we were talking about with respect to additional construction beyond that, the right of way and the basic service installed. And are there any grants, loans, can betterments be used? I mentioned that last week, or are there any subsidies that might be made available, for example, low income, elderly, those kinds of things. And I think this is on the next page. So, and then what funding sources might we be able to identify from the American Recovery Plan or the federal estate infrastructure spending, which I think we can anticipate may start to show up soon. Programs, are there specific programs that are aimed at senior citizens or schools or social service organizations, not-for-profits, healthcare, or affordable housing that might be leveraged? And I think I skipped over it above, but I had this notion that Concord Light specifically has some programs that are meant to try to support EV charging, and some of the infrastructure that you might install for electric vehicle charging might also be able to be installed alongside of fiber. And again, that ties into sustainability as well as some of the other goals for the organization. So what have I missed? And is there anything that
Do you mind, Mark, if I just suggest that the concept of resilience, I connect that in a way with the idea of, and I don't know if this will ever happen, but like a microgrid, which would be like an islandable source of power that could support the safety. A small section of Concord would be robust against a generalized outage by having a local grid that is self-generating. Maybe it's got solar, maybe it's got batteries, maybe it has diesel. Schools like Alcott, the public safety buildings, maybe the high school could all be in a local area. And anyway, maybe fiber fits into that too. So it'd be a resilient fiber. And that kind of connects in a way to that topic I was talking about earlier about the safety buildings. So anyway, I'm just saying that there may be some of that kind of money available too.
Yeah. And I think that falls into the idea of, grants that might support this. Is there anything else that anyone was thinking, might be an area of additional study? I know we're at this point, we're piling work on our plates and not talking about how to get it off, but.
Well, I just wanted to say that like there's this impasse, and we've talked about it, not just me tonight, about this impasse between, David, you were saying that the light plant just doesn't help, right? You want the light plant to do the job for you.
No, let me.
Wait. But
sorry,
that, I'm mischaracterizing your words, but let me use my words anyways. The point is who should pay for the more expensive last mile or the last 100 feet? And the policy has been for the light plant to push that onto the residents or the businesses. And, that's just the way it is. And that kind of works for the light plant because it means that as they've been deploying this business, they've been able to actually start with the easy cases. And if you're not an easy case and you're willing to pay to get to the right of way, then that's fine by Concord too. So in order to actually push it out a little bit more, then push it out faster, then Concord maybe needs to actually be willing to either do the work or pay for it. And now that's a question of like who's bearing the cost and what's fair here.
If I can get to that, I know we're late. We finally made the decision here that we're going to pay for it. But when we go and say, help us, tell us where we have to run the conduit, because we have a volunteer board, we're amateurs. If, at this process, it's, you find an electrician and we'll look at his plans after the plans are done. It's like, guys, we just need a little help here.
Yeah.
And they were great with the EV charging system that got put in here, but the broadband seems to be a more complicated process for us.
Yeah, and in their defense, this is a stance that the town of Concord has instinctively had for as long as I've been involved in town government. And what it is, it's actually comes from a fear and an opposition to corruption and local self-dealing. You say have a favored local contractor, and Concord's always calling them up and stuff like that. And that's the reason why they're all the bidding things. Anyway, it's part of the culture to begin with. And we've actually changed the culture in a number of ways.
Great.
So like the Green Your Heat program, we selected a contractor. So maybe we need to think about that.
Okay.
These are barriers to adoption.
And that sort of thinking is what I mean by, programmatic recommendations. Is there a need for a program to be established that is, for example, design assistance for, particularly for multi-dwelling units and those kinds of more complicated installs that have this element of some, of a three-way understanding. And I think that there are both generalized solutions. You can design the solution for how these things are going to work in the abstract, and then have some application have a process that's designed to sort of facilitate the application of that. And I do agree with you, Gordon. I think that particularly in sustainability, energy conservation and things, are getting to be lots more models about how to do such things. It's interesting to me that the broadband business is a business that generates a free cash flow and profit. And so it's a matter of what do you do with some of that money, and how do is it sensible to divert some of it into these areas so that we don't end up leaving portions of the population behind inadvertently. And I think that's what's so timely about this conversation.
Yeah, I wanted to make a point about that. If you compare, I don't know if business model is the right word, but maybe it is, but compare, Comcast sort of behavior. If you call up and say, hey, I want to be a Comcast customer, they come out and they hook you up. They don't say, oh, we have this issue, or the distance is too far, or they don't do that. Like, that's not what they do. I guess they're just able to take the longer view and say, we want this person as a customer. And, obviously they have bigger pocketbooks than municipalities. But, that maybe being aware that there is a different way to act might give us some ideas about maybe we can act more like, or the town, the broadband operation can act more like a bit the business, because that I don't know, that's the way to grow. And Mark said, divert some of the profits, and that's the kind of thing that we can think about.
Actually, to build on that, Gail, there's actually one thing that I think, and this goes to the sort of mid-game replan for broadband, given we started Concord started the broadband, and it wasn't clear that it was going to be financially viable. I mean, we did all the modeling and the planning, and Mark did a great job of executing on it. But now we can say that it is clearly got an attribute or something that is a sustainable business. And, you can, now it's time to maybe continue that investment, taking the slightly longer view. And I hope that what comes out of our committee meetings and recommendations is a hybrid of increasing the subscription amongst the ones that are easier to get to raise the revenue even further, and use that money or use money that comes from additional authorization to go after those that are underserved. And, we'll have to think about all that together. But I think that's the one thing that I think we can agree on, is that, the proof is there. We have a proven business model. We've got revenue. It's not a pilot, it's in production, and that's a huge, in the commercial world, that's a huge difference. Proof of concept, pilot, production, we're in production, so cool.
Very good. So keeping with my commitment to all of you to try to keep these at roughly 90 minutes per meeting, given it's weeknights and we're doing this every week. I think this is probably a pretty good place to begin to wrap up for today. You've seen these definitions. I think we would like to collect some feedback on them. We'd like to expand them a little bit more. And then I think it's appropriate to build the data requests behind each of these and begin to plan to present those to the entities, as well as look at what information we can gather. Does anyone have clearly we need the GIS data to understand the parcels and roads that are not served, identify as best as possible how many customers are on each of those parcels, whether they're residential or business, whether they're single customer locations or multiple dwelling units. I think those are, and there is a trove of information associated with the broadband order forms that can go to timing, and I believe some information about abandoned, I'll use the word abandoned orders, to refer to anything that wasn't completed for any reason, and trying to understand that. Is there any other data source that anybody that's come to mind that anyone particularly wants to name right now? Because what I'm thinking I will do is begin to draft some requests for this data and we'll spend some time next time on trying to refine what we mean by that and what we're really asking for. So I think that would be the main focus of the next meeting.
The only other thing I could think of, and I have no idea if it would be of any value, is I do know, and I know Carlin's on, so she would be able to clarify this. We do get some reports from our friends at Comcast as to their subscriptions and their revenue, and that information may be useful if we want to sort of look over the fence to say how many of those folks that are in town are subscribing to Comcast that represent opportunities for us. I don't know if that's useful information, but I thought I would just ask the question.
Yeah, extending that thought, the bundle, the service bundle, if you're a Comcast customer, Xfinity customer, you're already bundled into broadband. You get the TV and the phone along with it. Is that a barrier? In other words, what if I tried to keep my TV and phone, but just go with Concord? What's that going to cost me? If Comcast doesn't give me any money back for cutting off removing the data service, then now I'm doubly paying.
So I could probably undertake to write up a little description of what that would look like just based on the current rates. And interestingly enough, I've helped with somebody who's on the Internet Essentials, which is their low cost program. And by the way, it would be TV, phone, broadband, and alarm systems. Comcast offers alarm services now as well, which creates another whole kettle of fish. Because those alarm systems are not licensed and legal. Some people I know that are in the alarm business are a little upset because they're not licensed alarm service people. But that's something that does create a barrier for us. If someone has all those services, then they would have to go a la carte those in some way.
Yeah, we've done some napkin calculations here, and if you move, this is a year ago, if you remove the CMLP and then add TV, no in-home phone. I mean, I could only speak for what I don't have an in-home phone anymore. So I didn't add the in-home phone. Basic service, there was no savings going to CMLP. It's the same bill. My total bill was 118, so it came to about the same amount. CMLP plus basic TV service is about the same.
Yeah. When we were first
pay a lot more than I do.
When we were first offering the services, I know that we might roughly call this enablement kits, but that was a question that came up quite a bit from people, is just the how do I question. If I no longer have a triple play cable package, how do I get my video? What do I do for telephone? And so that, I think that how do I question is a very legitimate question to add to, that section B about what are the inhibitors, because setting aside the competitive questions about what does it actually cost, just are these services, what are comparable services available and what can be delivered? So that's a good one to get into.
Real quick, I did think of one other thing that may or may not be supporting for all this kind of documentation, which is there is also data on the number of hardwired phone lines that exist in town. And then that's, of course, declining at a tremendously fast rate as we all move to just using cellular in our homes. I don't know if that is information we want to consider. I am actually, now that I mention it, I don't think it's important, but I just thought I'd raise it.
Yeah, some of the earlier versions of the system actually did have, and again, it's the question of should we be in the telephone business or not be in the telephone business. Right. Again, that could come in under what services are offered, and are those services sufficient to meet the requirements or the needs of the customers. Okay.
Earlier, Gail asked, why can't we do what Comcast does in terms of really quick turnaround and availability? And I don't think that that's a data request that the town can help us with. But one question I'd have would be, how many people in Concord have cable service? And if it's above 50%, then that gives them a huge advantage over us.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we do get a summary report to the pay committee that describes, and again, Carlin's on this call, maybe she could help us, or I can look into it and report back because I don't have it on the top of my head, but we do get a summary report each year. I probably got every one that we've received in the last 4 years squirreled away that would let us know their subscription.
Yeah, if you could bring that to the next meeting, I think that'd be useful information, because that could actually explain what Gail observed.
Yeah, I would, for those of us who remember businesses like Manhattan Cable, though, back in the 60s, there were a large number of companies that tried to build cable TV service to homes and actually went out of business or were unable to deliver on a timely basis. And I think most of us kind of forget that coaxial cable wasn't always built to every single premise, no matter where. And the fundamental reason why the cable providers can be so fast is because they relatively rarely ever actually have to really pull new wire for you. And they do sometimes invest in reinstallations, but they do that on their own dime. And we're doing a new build where, on the fiber system, once the fiber is actually already installed, we often see, the ability to really quickly turn that around and use it again. So we're kind of at a different stage of construction of the capital investment. That said, many homes, especially in a place like Concord, are serviced by a cable which may be pushing 50 years old. And one of these days, some of that fiber will potentially be that age as well. So it's worthwhile to, as we think about, is it worth it for CMLP to spend money to actually push that fiber to that premise? I would at least, assert that it's a 50-year investment, and if you have to spend a few $1,000s on that 50-year investment, it's an investment that's well worth making, and sooner the better.
But I would just say, to Gail's point, is that we live in a society that says I can order it today and have it tomorrow in everything we do.
Yes.
And I know I appreciate the CMLP disadvantage, but people do not want to wait.
Right.
Unfortunately.
So from a policy perspective, that really raises the question of how do you spend capital? How much debt are you willing to take on? And how long is those payback periods, and what's your confidence level? And
Absolutely.
I think we have a responsibility to sort of take a stand on those issues and at least recommend some positions on behalf of CMLP. I think that's clearly right down the middle of what we need to be doing here.
Out of the box, CMLP has a disadvantage.
Yeah.
Yeah,
On
I mean,
that-
the original model was to invest, authorize up to $1 million, and I think we've consumed like up to 1.5, but we were very bounded in this investment originally. So.
Yeah. So on that score, I think I'm ready to take public comments on the way to adjournment for today. Unless there's any objection, I'll ask if anyone does have a comment. And I see Carlin beat you, Cherry. So
One of the very few times. Thanks, Carlin Reed, 83 West End. Two things, Gail, in response to your question about the prompt service, keep in mind that Comcast, as a franchised cable operator, is under a contractual obligation to service and provide service to every residential home in Concord under certain performance metrics. So that type of regulatory control does not exist with the broadband service. So there is a distinction there. The point that I wanted to suggest that you folks consider is you're going to be talking about a lot of data, a lot of complex concepts. I would recommend that you incorporate a couple of case studies or case scenarios to use as examples, such as Concord Green, of course, but also the Peter Buckley Terrace, Everett Gardens, one of the public housing units. There are certain financing opportunities there. I spoke recently with a representative from the Concord Housing Authority, and he enlightened me that there's a difference whether it's a state-owned property versus a federal owned property. So that's another possibility that you can consider. I don't want to add to your workload because it's huge already. And I do think you're going along the right track. So you're doing a good job, folks. That's it.
Thanks for your comments. Those are some interesting thoughts, Colin. Terry.
Yes, I enjoyed the discussion tonight. I learned a lot. It's a lot more complicated than just who's going to. There's a lot of nuances. I particularly like that between Gordon and David about that. You know, that the average homeowner like me doesn't understand nuances. So you're going along this very well. And I was wondering if you might consider, next week is fine, but then for the remainder of October and November, when Greg and I have to go to the Finance Committee at 7 o'clock almost every Thursday, whether maybe this group could meet at 6 o'clock. I don't know. If that doesn't work, don't worry about it. But if you can do it, then Greg and I can watch more of your meeting. It's really up to you. But next week, there's no conflict.
Okay, so we'll, why don't the members of the task force give me some feedback on that, and we could certainly adjust the schedule as a matter of convenience, and so that I was, could lighten the load on town staff a little bit. I did go ahead and get our meeting scheduled through the end of October, just so that we have a slot. But if it makes sense to move that, it would certainly, it would be okay with me. I don't know if anybody else wants to respond right away. Greg?
Even if you move it to 6 on that night, I won't be able to attend. So don't move on my part.
Thank you for that. Okay. Anyone else?
Next Thursday night, I have an annual meeting for Concord Green, so I'm a little, I can join you late, probably.
Okay.
The annual meeting takes 25 minutes.
Okay.
I could join you, I'll have to get out of the meeting and come back into your meeting.
Yeah.
I may also be late or hard to reach. I'm driving up to Jay Peak with my family for a hockey tournament. So I don't know what time we're gonna get there, but I could, I could try to dial in on the phone if at a minimum.
So if we moved back in time next week to 7 or even 7:30, would that be better for everyone?
So it'd probably be better for me.
Okay.
I should be able to accommodate that, but again, I may be on, like last time, be on the phone, so
Okay.
won't be able to take minutes.
Great. So we'll consider that as an option. All right.
Are you looking for a motion to adjourn?
I believe I am, and I was giving it a split second for anybody else if they have a final comment. And if not, yes, I'm looking for a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn the meeting for tonight.
I second that.
Thank you. So will the clerk call the roll?
Oh, I should have known you were going to do that. So Mark,
Aye.
Gail,
Hi.
let me see. Gordon,
Aye.
Scott says aye. And David,
Aye.
I think that's it.
So we're adjourned at 8:14.